Yeah, Jack Needham, and came to the college in 1969.
Okay.
And I came as a full-time counselor.
Mm.
And I also was assigned to teach part-time introductory psychology classes, which I did throughout my whole career here.
So, where did you grow up, and what was that like, and what did your parents do for work?
Well, if you ask certain people, they'll probably tell you I never did grow up. But, okay. I grew up in New Britain, Connecticut, and I spent all my life in Connecticut, with the exception of about a year or so when I lived in Boston when I was going to graduate school. My mother came from a fairly large working class family, and she was a very, very bright woman. She had managed to go to a private school only because my grandmother just insisted that she and her brothers get a good education. And she ended up working in various positions, mostly as a bookkeeper for a department store. My father did a number of things. He designed houses at one point. He built houses at another point. He eventually ended up owning a small business repairing appliances. So that was my background. We lived in a three-family tenement in New Britain, Connecticut. I lived there until I was 25, and then I moved out, got married, then went on to graduate school.
Where did you go to high school?
I went to, it was called St. Thomas Aquinas High School in New Britain, Connecticut. It's no longer there. It kind of went the way a lot of those schools did.
Now, where in New Britain did you grow up? Did you grow up in like the Polish part of the town, or?
No, the Polish area, well, it was even then fairly strong in terms of its Polish heritage. Not as strong as it is now. But I lived probably 2-3 miles from there. There's an area in New Britain called Walnut Hill Park, and I lived on the sort of the southwestern edge of Walnut Hill Park. In fact, grew up. I feel like I grew up in Walnut Hill Park 'cause we were always there.
Now, how do you feel about Mari Russell?
Don't know.
No?
Yeah. Don't know.
So, after high school, where did you go to college? What did you major in, and what made you want to take that major on?
Good question. After high school,
What year did you graduate?
1961. So after high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I was just not ready to go to college. So I went to work doing, really crap jobs and hated every one of them. I think the job that convinced me that I needed to do something with my life was, if you're familiar with sprinkler systems in buildings, well, I was supposed to be an apprentice learning how to do these. So the first job they assigned me to was a hangar at Bradley Field. And the first thing they asked me to do was to climb this ladder, go up and way up on top, and climb around the structure and check all of the sprinkler heads. And I was afraid of heights. So the guy told me, he says, you either do it or you go home. This is it. So I got up there, climbed off the ladder. He took the ladder away. And he said, I'll see you at noon. And this was like 8 o'clock in the morning. So I spent the whole morning holding onto a beam about 30 feet in the air.
So it was exposure therapy then?
Oh, yeah. Plus, every morning we would meet like at 7 in the morning. And I would go and I would sit with these guys and have my coffee while they drank. I said to myself, there's got to be a better way of life than this. In August of that year, a friend of mine had been going to a small college up in Maine. And he said, you know what? He says, I think you could get into that college. Why don't you give it a try? So I went and I spoke to the principal of the high school I graduated from, who didn't know me because he wasn't there then. And he said, you know what? I'm going to give you a recommendation. And that was my start in college. So I stayed there for a while, then went to Central Connecticut State University, and then on to Boston College. And then I did some post-master's degree study at UConn.
So you got your bachelor's at Central
Right.
and your master's at BC?
Master's at BC.
Now, what years did that happen?
61 was when I graduated in high school. 66 is when I graduated from Central. And 68 is when I graduated from BC.
And what areas of study did you do?
As an undergraduate, it was a major in psychology, minor in sociology, anthropology. And then my master's degree was in counseling psychology.
And what kind of got you interested in those fields?
I don't know. You know, I don't know. I started out thinking that maybe I would want to be a dentist, or maybe I'd want to get into medicine. And I was a biology major for, I think, 2 years. And I decided, no, this is not really what I want. I had taken, interestingly enough, I had taken a course in the evening at Central, an introductory psychology class. And the guy that taught it was a part-time instructor, full-time psychologist. Just blown away by that class. And it was a class that, I mean, I would put everything else aside and I would study for that class. I was just so fascinated by it. And that got me hooked. I mean, that was it. This idea that there was a science that you could study that would help you not only to understand yourself better, but other people as well. It was just totally fascinating to me.
Now, what was his name, if I may ask?
His name was Dr. Brodsky. And you know, this was like 50 plus years ago. And I can see him, remember him clearly. Major influence.
And just out of curiosity, what religious order ran Thomas Aquinas High School? You remember?
Yeah, Sisters of Notre Dame d'Amour. Yeah. They were known for their commitment to education. Every teacher I had was a nun, but every one of them had a minimum of a master's degree or beyond. And most of them were in the process of working on their PhDs.
Wow.
Brilliant women. They were just brilliant.
So, you finished your studies.
Yep.
And what just led you? What got you to Middlesex? You know, what was the journey
Yeah.
like?
That's an interesting question. I was telling Patrick just briefly earlier, it was about this time of year when I was in graduate school. I had gotten married the previous December. And I was sitting in a professor's office with him, and he looked at me and he said to me, he says, "What are your plans? You're going to be finished sometime this summer. What are you going to do?" And I looked at him and I said, "I don't know." So he says, "Well," he says, "don't you think you should start thinking about that?" I said, "Yeah, I do." I said, "Do you have any suggestions?" And he said, "Yeah." He says, "You know, I've been reading about this new community college system just starting in Connecticut. Why don't you look into them? They'll probably be interested in hiring some people." I knew absolutely nothing about it. I didn't even know community colleges existed. So I called, got a telephone number, and I called, got an interview. I interviewed with somebody at what was then called Greater Hartford Community College, now Capital. And then I also at the same time had an interview a few days later here with Phil Wheaton, who was then dean. And they both offered me positions. But Phil said that I can't hire you because Hartford has first grabs. But he said, if you're not happy there, call me. So probably a little less than a year later, I called Phil and I said, "Hey, Phil, not happy up here. Is the offer still open?" He said, "Well, come down and talk. We'll think about it." So I did, and he hired me in 1969. That's when I started.
Now, what was the interview with Wheaton like?
At the time that I first interviewed with him and applied, Middlesex was not Middlesex Community College. It was a division of Manchester Community College. Manchester being the first community college in our system. And Manchester was an outgrowth of a community college that was a part of the education department for the city of Manchester. It then became a community college taken over by the state. They established Middlesex as a branch. And then a very interesting guy by the name of Wilbur Snow. He was, I think he was a professor at Wesleyan. He served as, I think he holds the distinction of being governor for a day. He was a fascinating man who believed strongly that this college should have its own, this town should have its own college. And
Now,
he
what was the
did it.
governor for a day with Snow, if I may ask? 'Cause a couple
What was that
people
about?
mentioned
I don't know what that was, to be honest with you. I never had a good explanation as to why he was governor for that day. That I can't tell you. Be an interesting question to research. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we have a whole.
So anyway, that's how Middlesex got established. So he was, a little bit later I'll tell you another story about him, but he was a phenomenal man. He bright, PhD educated. He served as director of educational for the military overseas for quite a few years. Just fascinating man, but a real human being, just down-to-earth guy. And I knew when I first talked to him, I would like to work for him. Quirky as hell, but really couldn't help but like the guy.
And that's who Snow Hall's named after, and I believe, and there's a school, there's an elementary school in Middletown.
Yes, yes,
Snow School.
yeah, yeah.
So
His home still exists over on Newfield Avenue. Yeah.
You get the job.
Yep.
And now, take us through those first couple of years or months, even if because it developed. What was that like, and how is that like being integrated into Middlesex?
So I got hired, and at the same time, another person got hired, and his name was Dick Lupino. And Dick was a counselor, hired as a counselor like I was. He eventually went on and became the college's first financial aid officer. So our offices were at 425 Hunting Hill Avenue, a little Cape Cod house that we were leasing from the Middletown Board of Ed. And our office was upstairs on one of the 2 bedrooms upstairs, left-hand side. And there were 2 desks. The front of my desk faced the front of Lupino's desk. And so he was a real outgoing guy. We hit it off really well. Come to find out, he lived 2 blocks away from where I lived in Berlin at the time. So we formed a very close friendship for years. We traveled back and forth to work. We sat together. One of the interesting anecdotes with him was the only telephone we had was one phone, rotary dial with a couple of buttons on it. And Dick had the hardest time mastering that phone system, right? So my given name is John, but everybody refers to me as Jack. So Richard's sitting there one day, the phone rings, picks it up, he goes, hello. He says, no, he's not here. Hangs it up and he looks at me, he says, wow. He says, I did that well, didn't I? I says, Richard, can you ask me who they were asking for? And he said, yeah, Jack. I says, that's me. He says, shit. I mean, oh sugar. So that's kind of how our introduction was. It was so informal environment. I mean, we had a lot of things to do. We had a lot of responsibility. But there was a feeling that just do what you have to do. Forget about your job description. Forget about who does what. Just get things done. So the first exposure I had was to assist the director of counseling in planning an orientation program. Phil's office was at Weeks Hall at Connecticut Valley Hospital. No, it was at Stanley Hall at Connecticut Valley Hospital. It was an abandoned building that the state said you guys can use. I mean, that's how the state thought of us at the time. So Phil insisted that when we did an orientation for the freshman students, they had to be brought from Hunting Hill Avenue. They had to be bused up to Stanley Hall at CVH and then back again. So we had to work out a schedule of how we were going to do that. So that was my first assignment. The second assignment was to show up at a registration. At the time, registration was being coordinated by a person who went on eventually to be the first Dean of Administration. His name was Bradley Biggs. And Bradley was ex-military. Super guy, he was a very accomplished guy. But he had set up probably the worst registration system you can think of. So imagine you're in a building, classroom building, and you had the English department in this room, the history department in this room, math in another room. So every individual discipline was in a separate room. So now you're a student and you want an English class. So you walk into that room, you talk to an advisor, they write you on their roster. So now you go to the math department. You go into the math department and find out the course you want is the same time as the history class you just signed up for. So now you got to go back to the history room and see if there's another class. You make the change only to end up back in the math room and find out that class just closed. I mean, there were students literally from 8 o'clock in the morning till 2 or 3 in the afternoon trying to get registered.
The same students?
The same students. So he also hired Tony Burns, who since passed away, but Tony was the first registrar. And a little while after the whole fiasco, Tony came into my office, he sat down with me, and he says, we got to do something about this. He says, I'm not going to put students through that again. So we made some major changes in the registration system. So it was whatever needed to be done. When a student walked in, had a question, we took care of it. If Phil Wheaton called and said he needed help with something, we went up to CVH and helped him out with it. And that's kind of how our introduction was. So we just did what needed to be done.
Now, when you first came to the new Middlesex campus where you are now, what was your first impression? Like, was it like kind of a sense of relief that Middlesex had like gotten to this level?
Yeah, very good question. And I was thinking a lot about that this morning. We were all excited that we were going to be in a facility that was our own, and that it would be relatively new. I mean, from the get-go, it was probably not ever adequate to the needs that we had, not even back then. But we were still pretty excited about it. But at the same time, at least in my mind, it was the beginning of a change. And it was a change to a system that was becoming more top-heavy administratively. It was becoming more consistently bureaucratic. We were growing, and we're experiencing some growing pains. And I think it marked the point at which it was going to be impossible to maintain the kind of informal atmosphere that we had had for those years. One of the things I thought about an awful lot is how, and I couldn't possibly explain it to you or to anyone who hasn't experienced it, but to be at the beginning of a brand new system, not just a brand new college, but a whole brand new system, to be there at that time with a group of people who came from so many different backgrounds. None of us came from community colleges because there were hardly any to come from to start with. So we all had to find our way together. And there was kind of a bond and a camaraderie that existed that I've never experienced since then, and I don't think I ever will. But it has impacted my life forever,
Now,
absolutely forever.
Now, when you came here, you said like that the informal environment changed. Like, how did like your friendships and like your communication with the professors here evolve?
I think that communication was always good, but I think we saw a more of a rift between. We were developing more of an us and them mentality between faculty and administration. And I think some of us who had been here for a long time prior to that, along with the faculty who had been here, I think we preserved our connections, our relationships. But you could see that drift happening. I want to go back for a minute to the earliest times when I was here, just to give you an indication of what it was like and what Phil Wheaton was like as a human being. I transferred from Greater Hartford Community College, and I had been here for 2 weeks, and we were getting paid bi-weekly, every 2 weeks. Phil Wheaton walked into my office one morning, across Hunting Hill Avenue, pulled out an envelope, and he handed it to me. And in it was a personal check. All he said to me was, "The folks up in Harvard screwed up on your paycheck." And he says, "It didn't come through." He said, "This is my personal check." He says, "Until we get it straightened out, I will be paying you." For 16 weeks, that man came in every 2 weeks. He didn't call me to come up to his office. He came down to my office and apologized and then handed me a personal check. He says, "The only thing I ask, when you get your paycheck, pay me back." I got that first paycheck. The first thing that I did was cash it and write out a check and drive up to Stanley Hall to his office. That cemented my relationship with that man forever. When he left, when Phil Wheaton left the college finally, retired, all of the people that he had hired, he came into our offices and he put down on my desk, it was my original application for employment. And he had written personal notes on it. He went to everybody and did the same thing with all handwritten personal notes with thank yous. And on mine, he said, "I wasn't sure that you were going to work out pretty well. Boy, was I wrong. Thank you." Signed, Phil Wheaton. I mean, that's pretty incredible. Pretty amazing. You know, he had his faults. He had his quirks like everybody else. Every staff meeting that we had, and they were staff meetings, not faculty meetings, all staff would meet. And he would give a brief presentation of some things that were going on, but at every single meeting, he took time to talk about one or two staff members who were there and what they were doing. Not just what they were doing on campus, but how were the kids doing? They were going on vacation, or they were recognized in town for for something they had done to the community. He always did that. So I don't think, very few people have ever had a work environment or experience to have had that kind of relationship with the person who was the top. After a registration, he'd invite all the staff who were involved in registration to his house, and he'd cook dinner for them. I mean, extraordinary, totally extraordinary experience. So, I mean, those are the, when I talk about that early experience, it's hard to capture what that meant and how that had an influence on me as a person, and what we were willing then to do for him.
Now, as time went on, how did like the teaching environment like change for you? Like, how did like technology impact you and everything?
In terms of my work in student services, I eventually left counseling. I was director of summer school for a while, and then I was director of admissions and records for a while, and then I was admissions director and then dean of students. And when we first started out, we had no technology. I mean, the first technology of any kind that I remember we had were electronic typewriters. You know, we had electric typewriters, but we had these electronic typewriters where you could actually type in like an admissions letter and store it in the typewriter, and then hit a button and have it type out automatically. That was what we had for technology. And then we moved a little bit into word processing. Then we moved into a system that was mainframe based, all character based, pretty dependent on central processing. It really didn't do much for us. Then we got a registration system, and it was okay as a registration system, but it didn't do much else for us. And then we moved into the system we have now, which is Banner, which I had a lot of involvement in that.
What was it called? Was it called Marcos before?
It was called Marcos, yep.
Right.
It was MARKOS, and it stood for Management and Record Keeping Online System. But it really had to do with a guy by the name of Mark Bannon, and he was Director of Information Systems in Hartford, and he wrote the whole system. The guy was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant. But at some point, it could no longer do the things we needed it to do, and that's when we went outside and bought the Banner system. That's in use today.
Now, what made you buy the Banner system? Like, I assume there were like other options. Like, were you involved in that?
Yeah, I was heavily involved in that. In 1995, I got a call from the Chancellor's office. I was then Dean of Students and had been very involved in system-wide activities. And they asked if I would come and work with them to do a needs analysis for student services aspect of a new system, which I did. And then they asked if I would be a part of a team that evaluated the various possible options. And then I did that. And then I took a leave of absence from the college for a couple of years to help to implement the system. So I was heavily involved in the Banner system. To answer your question, at the time, it was the only system of its kind that could handle what we needed it to do. And we were a system then of about 46,000 students. And we were generating well over 1 million records even in the beginning. So we needed a system that could handle it, and they had the capability to grow. And the Banner system was really the only act in town at the time.
So you have all this time accumulated in Middlesex.
Yep.
You've had all these experiences. What do you think was the most impactful or important or your favorite experience out of everything that's happened?
Yeah, I thought about that too quite a bit. I'll give you one anecdote that kind of sums up how I feel about that. I was teaching a course, and I was teaching it at. Let me back up. It wasn't the course that I was teaching. That's another story. So this one's more important. I was dean of students. A gentleman, probably in his mid to late 20s at the most, came into my office. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. And he sat down, and he just looked so frustrated. Angry, but he was not hollering or yelling, just frustrated. So I asked him, I said, what's going on? What's happening? He says, I don't understand. I have to explain something to you. And I have to say this is rare, but this is what happened. He says, I work at Connecticut Valley Hospital. And he says, I'm an aide. And he said, my job is, I get out at 7 o'clock in the morning. If my replacement doesn't show up, I can't leave until they do. So he said, this morning my replacement was late. He says, I have a class here. I think it was like an 8:30 class in the morning. And he says, I have never missed a class. He says, I was running late. He says, I ran home. I changed quickly. I got to class. He says, I was less than 10 minutes late. And he said, the door to the classroom was locked. He says, I knocked on the door, and the instructor said, the rule is the rule. If you're late, you can't come to class. And he said, what was that all about? He said, do you know how much this class means to me? He said, do you know how hard I struggled to get to that class on time, to not miss it? That really, really, really summed up for me what I had been experiencing for years before that and for many years after that, is how many students came into my office with issues. How many students in my classroom came to class despite the fact that they had so many barriers to their education. They had financial barriers, they had home responsibilities. They didn't have the luxury that so many people had of having parents that could afford to send them to private school, and they didn't have to work. These kids had, some of them had families, some of them were overcoming so many obstacles, but their education meant so damn much to them. They did everything they possibly could. I can remember having students in my classes that I taught at nighttime show up totally prepared, taking exams, papers on time. I'll give you, just as by means of comparison, I had an opportunity for a few years to teach part-time at a private university. And I had students who were, unbelievably privileged. And I remember telling the head of the department, he said, well, how is your experience here compared to your experience at the community colleges? I said, to be honest with you, I said, I'll teach at a community college any day before I want to teach here anymore. I said, these kids don't care. I said, they really don't care. I said, I just see so many who are struggling for their education. So that's my takeaway from my experience here. I learned from them. I used to say to myself, my kids would complain once in a while. And I remember one time saying to my son, you're complaining? Come with me. Spend a day with me. That's the impact that it had on me. That's what I probably remember the most, is what I learned from those students. And so many of them.
When did you receive the title dean? Because you mentioned how you were a counselor,
Yeah.
and then you were dean of students. But what was that transition like? Was it a new deanship, or how did that work?
All right, let me see if I get the order here. I had been, when I was a counselor, I worked a lot with Norm Zabel, who was the director of admissions. And he and I got to know each other really well, and I used to help him out with interviews and things. He went on a leave of absence, and I was appointed as an interim director of admissions. I think the decision was made that Norm would then go in as an interim dean of continuing education, so I was then appointed permanently as director of admissions. The then dean of students, who left the position, I was then appointed as interim dean for a year. And then I think it was like a year later, the position came open permanently. And so I applied for it. It was an internal search at first. And I was offered the job, so I took it. So that's how I came into that position.
Now, how long were you here till?
How long where?
How long, when did you retire?
I officially retired from the community college system in 1999.
Okay, so you were here for Wheaton, Chapman, Sullivan, and Hart, correct?
No, I was in Hartford at the time that Hart was Hart.
Okay. So, what was your opinion, well, you've already told us a little bit about Wheaton. What was your opinion about Chapman and Sullivan? How were they as people?
Now, were they?
Yeah.
The comparison is interesting because there were three very different people that I worked under, very different. Bob Chapman I really liked a lot. Bob was very down to earth, very smart, very practical. You could sit down and talk to him. You could sit down and work with him. But he could be very decisive when he needed to be. And so I got along really well with him. Didn't always maybe agree, but that's okay. And that was another thing. You could disagree with him. He was fine with that. So he was very approachable as a president. You could knock on his door and ask to talk to him, and if he wasn't involved in something important at the moment, come on and let's talk. So we had that kind of a relationship with him. One of the interesting anecdotes is we had a dean of administration when Bob Chapman was president and I was in the admissions office. And every fall we would lease a car from the state of Connecticut motor pool to do admissions, to go out and do recruiting. So the dean of administration decided that they were going to save some money and not rent the car. So I said, well, then I can't do my job. So the dean says, well, you won't have any choice. I said, oh yeah, I do have a choice. I'm just not going to do any recruiting of high schools this fall. Let's see how that works. So it precipitated a meeting with the dean of students, the dean of administration, the president, and me. So we're getting nowhere in this meeting, right? So finally I said to the dean of administration, I have the solution. And the solution is, because the dean said, well, we're going to reimburse you. I said, no, you're going to reimburse me enough to pay for my gas, but not to cover my insurance, not to cover my wear and tear. Plus, if I get into an accident, it's my insurance that takes the hit. So I said, my solution is, I'm going to borrow your car and you take the reimbursement. So the president looked at the dean and said, you know what? Just get the damn car, will you please? And that was the end of that discussion. But that's the kind, he could be like that when he had to be. He was just getting tired of the nonsense, so he did it. So Sullivan was very interesting as a president. I think, personally, I liked her. Personally, I got along very well with her. I learned some things from her. And I think she gave me some opportunities that I would probably not have otherwise had. I mean, she included us as a team, as a management team, and pretty much everything that went on. So I that was fine. I had no issues there with her. Yeah.
Any other questions, guys?
One last question. Well, actually, you can go.
Looking back, was there anything you would do different?
There are certain times in my history here, had you asked me that question, I probably might have said yes. But sitting here today thinking back, probably not. No, I don't think so. One of the things I found very interesting, there are some people who have a fairly clear idea of what they want to do with their lives, and they kind of map out that process and then follow it. That's never been me. My life has been a series of decisions I made at the moment, not expecting to have to make them. Not knowing where it was going to lead me, but not looking back and regretting that I made them when I did. So, no, I thought about the decision to leave here, to take a leave of absence. And I'm glad I did it, because it opened up opportunities for me that would never have been opened if I hadn't done that. But, a year before I did it, I had no inkling that I would be doing that. And that's how it would happen.
Yeah, I have a vague memory. Were you the one that explained to us about email and gave us our email addresses? Or is that?
No, I don't
or am
think so.
conflating things?
No, I wouldn't have done that.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't have done that.
I remember you sat us down, at least in a room, was it in Wheaton?
That might have been for banner training.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
'Cause I remember,
Yeah.
yeah. Or maybe you sat us down to explain banner.
Yeah, I did that a couple of times here. We did some
Yeah.
training on the banner system. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You guys got any other questions?
I'm all good.
All
Okay,
set?
anything else you'd like to share? Any other anecdotes or memories or statements you'd like to make?
Yeah, one thing struck me this morning when I was taking a shower. I have all kinds of inspiration when I'm taking a shower. 90% of the time I forget what it was by the time I'm done with my shower. But when I was thinking about the events that I've kind of described, some of which I described to you, there's a theme. that runs through them that didn't hit me until this morning. And the most important things that I remember, the things that came to mind, all had to do with connections and friendships and interrelationships that I made with students and staff while I was here. But I remember clearly interactions I had with, when I worked as a dean of students with the student government. I remember clearly the friendships I formed with faculty members and students and staff that today I have. I have a student that I'm still very much in touch with. So that shaped my life. That was what shaped my life.
Very
No
good.
regrets.